Good evening. Good evening. I'm Janet Harris, President of the Indiana Council on World Affairs. This evening, we launched the Indiana Council on World Affairs Great Decisions 2026. This is the first of what will be 8 sessions during the coming 8 weeks. Great Decisions, published by the Foreign Policy Association, is the basis of national discussion by groups around the country and here in Indiana. It can be ordered at educational discount from indianaworld.org. This evening, we'll be learning about how human rights is fundamental for peace building, and we'll be referencing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a highly translated document often referred to as humanity's law, and how these relate to events here at home. To introduce this evening's program is Dr. Betty Tonsing, board member and vice president of programs for our council, who has organized this series along with board members. Dr. Tonsing has spent 15 years overseas on contracts with the United Nations, USAID, including through Catholic Relief Services and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, and through the State Department as a Fulbright Scholar and Senior Fulbright Specialist. She has served in Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East. Dr. Tonsing will now be introducing our speaker, Dr. George Lopez, and our moderator for this evening, Dr. Ray Montagno. Dr. Tonsing.
Thank you, Janet. And it's wonderful to have our speaker back. Dr. Lopez has spoken with us before, and it was a wonderful program about a very similar topic. And he was absolutely first in mind when I had responsibility on the committee for this particular topic. And I'm thrilled to have him back. And when you hear about his background and when he speaks this evening, you'll understand why. Dr. Lopez is the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, where he was a founding faculty member. He is a leading expert in economic sanctions, peace building, and various peace-related issues. As a logical extension of his teaching and research with the Kroc Institute, Dr. Lopez is engaged in a diverse set of policy and public roles, some of which he will definitely draw from this evening in the program. He served as interim executive director of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist in 1997 and chaired its board of directors, presiding over what I know you are familiar with, the changing of the hands of the doomsday clock in 2002. And maybe you might tell us where we are on that clock this evening. As a senior research associate at the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs, he assisted with the council's post-9/11 public programming throughout the U.S. He also served as vice president of the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peace Building at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. He has advised the United Nations, various international agencies and governments on economic sanctions, ranging from the design of targeted financial sanctions to redressing their negative humanitarian impacts. He was the founding director of the Kroc Institute's Summer Institute on Teaching Peace in the 21st Century. And while at the U.S. Institute of Peace, Dr. Lopez led the creation of the Global Campus online peace-building education program. I would love to have attended that. He has accompanied the development of the university-led peace-building programs in Poland, Colombia, Ecuador, and later as a Fulbright Senior Specialist. And as a side note, we were talking earlier, I need to say this because I love plugging the World Affairs Councils of America. You know, there's a National World Affairs Councils of America, and then there are councils like we are all across the United States. We may be sort of small, perhaps, but we leave a very large footprint and keep popping up in wonderful and interesting ways. There are great stories about the building of the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame, but Father Hesburgh, who was formidable in all that he did in making the University of Notre Dame more than just a Catholic university, but a huge footprint in the educational world as a Catholic school and a research school, went to San Diego to hear, to try to connect with Joan Kroc. And he attended what she was attending also, the San Diego Council of World Affairs in 1985, which is where they met. And the relationship began with his describing what they were trying to build at Notre Dame, why, how it was in alignment with the mission to serve. And he didn't have to do a lot of arm twisting because she just about leapt to her feet and said, "I'm in." There's more to it than that, but they became very, very close friends. And there's wonderful stories that went beyond that. And at this point, I want to introduce Dr. Ray Montano, or Ray. He does serve with us on the board of the Indiana Council of World Affairs, was our previous president. And Ray is going to have a conversation with George. And then you all know, for those of you who are new, please pencil in your questions. You will have an opportunity 45 minutes in to ask Dr. Lopez speak a question of your own. We take great pride in our robust Q&A that we have. So I will see you at the end to say goodbye and tell you more about what to look forward to. But this evening, we have Dr. George Lopez. Ray, please.
Okay, thank you, Betty. And welcome to everyone. Just as follow up on what Betty said about the public question and answer session at the end, if you send your questions to the chat room, we will accumulate them there, and I will call on you to kind of ask your questions at that time. So with that, I'll start our conversation with George. George, we really appreciate having you here tonight. Um, I don't think we can kind of start this conversation about human rights without looking at what's going on at home right now in Minneapolis. We got really two issues I think that maybe we should address with respect to Minneapolis. One is, what's happening with American citizens and their right to protest peacefully, and the second is, what's happening with the immigrants in Minneapolis and nationally in terms of their kind of starting their position in the United States under Biden rules and all of a sudden moving the goalpost for many of these immigrants with the Trump rules. So maybe you could kind of comment on both of those issues right now.
Nothing like starting off with the most difficult question first, Ray.
Yeah.
First, let me say how delighted I am to be with you all this evening. I cherish the past times we've been able to be with this group, and think that what you're doing is so important in this time period to be able to have some good reading, critical reflection, probably a diversity of opinions on these things. I'm very happy to be here and share my perspective, but also happy when somebody turns in a question and says, "This guy's crazy. Here's how I think this ought to go." That makes for good conversation, and we're fortunate enough to be in a country which still permits that most of the time. So let's take advantage of it. What about the situation going on in our own country, particularly in Minneapolis? A couple of things from me that you may have heard from other commentators. If this were a fully legally based sweep of people in Minneapolis who were here fraudulently and illegally and who had committed a crime, then I don't think anyone would stand in the way because A, you wouldn't need the show of force that this has been. You could do this with 15 or 20 agents, as it's usually done in many cities. You'd start by going to the jails and say, who are the folks you have arrested that you're holding who don't have papers and don't whatever, whatever, and find out what due process they've had. And then you go and deal with them consistent with the law. What's happened, as we all know from the headlines, is very different from that. And what's happening with citizen groups like ourselves here is we're told you better know your rights because even if you don't fit the profile, which they're using to pull people out of cars or to find a way to enter their homes, there's certain things that American citizens, in the name of human rights that's proclaimed in our Constitution and protected, people have to know. In fact, one of the things you've got to know is now this cluster of letters, KYR, Know Your Rights, is on various places and something people can appeal to. First right, of course, is as a resident of the United States, even not a citizen, but as a resident of the United States, you are entitled to remain silent when a police officer approaches you. You're entitled to say, I think I want to talk to a lawyer. And even if you're not a citizen, that needs to be honored. That's not a Biden rule. That's a rule that's been consistent in the United States since the 1960s. It's also the case that you have a right to remain silent when somebody has said, I know what you're doing and I know who you are, and now you're out here and we're sending you to El Salvador. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to counsel. You have a right to ask for what's the warrant for your arrest. And if it's not produced in writing, signed by a judge, you're not being detained legally. Now, as we've watched and seen, that isn't operative, and there's not a lawyer hanging around next to somebody who's been abducted from their car or stopped on the street who can say, wait a minute, that's not a legal warrant, or there's no warrant. As the representative of this person, I therefore decide in the following way. People have been sort of caught by surprise by this. Also, very important, what Minneapolis has sort of kicked off in terms of the national dialogue is what's the rights of protesters? A question we haven't really dealt with since the late 1960s and civil rights demonstrations, or in some of the anti-war demonstrations of the 60s and the early 70s. What's very, very important is, as we're seeing in Minneapolis, everyone has the right to take pictures or film on their cell phone or on another device. There's nothing about filming in a public place what's going on, including with police officers, that is either threatening or illegal. That's a guaranteed right in 50 states in the United States and enshrined by the rights of free speech by our Constitution. And these are the things that are up for grabs, are being challenged, are being dealt with. As I was preparing to come on, catching the last little bit of news, a car in Minneapolis with two or three people in it who are part of the watch committees had spotted two ICE vans taking off and going somewhere, and they followed them, including stopping the right stop signs, et cetera, et cetera. And it was clear that one of them in the passenger side had their phone on. ICE van stopped, armed men got out, both sides of the car, pulled the people out, told them they were under arrest for obstructing a police operation. That's where we are, and it's very, very unfortunate. But I think one of our questions will be about how are human rights protected throughout the world, and it's often by civil society movements. And we're starting to witness a civil society movement in many, many ways. One other little thing I'd say is, Ray, it wasn't a Biden set of rules and now a Trump set of rules. There's been an evolving set of rules about how to treat people here illegally uh, over the last 40 years. One of the things that I try to remind audiences of is that in 2024, in the summer, the Congress reached a far-reaching bipartisan bill called the Border Security and Asylum Reform in Emergency Situations Act. And it had significant bipartisan support, was about to pass the House, then sent on to the Senate. And candidate Trump called every single Republican and said, you pass this bill, it will take out the center of my platform for running for president, which is we're in crisis and we have to get these illegals out of the country. Because this bill was far reaching about what you do on the border for allowing people in, a huge amount of money devoted to better border security, but asylum judges and asylum processing, and a whole new way to think about the never never land between crossing a border legally with an asylum claim and then how long you have to wait and how that process unfolds. The United States Congress had this in hand 18 months ago, and it's now vanished from our midst in the heightened partisan uh, situation we find ourselves in under the new rules created by Stephen Miller and Donald Trump and some others. I'm sorry that for the first answer is highly partisan, but I was asked the question, and as an expert and a citizen, that's my answer. Again, I'm happy to discuss this further. Fire away, Ray.
All right. Well, so just as kind of a follow-up to that, we now live in an era of instant media. Everybody's got cell phones and so forth. Back in the old days, it was you could probably hide some human rights violations quite easily. You know, they happen in one place and maybe just a couple of witnesses, but there's no video recording. We now have all of this media and recording. Do you think that will change the behavior of offenders, or is this not very effective anyhow?
Um, I think it's a race between who controls what technologies and how and why. It's a race between is there an audience of well-meaning people out there that can discern accurate information from not accurate? Are there multiple information sources that can allow an individual sitting in their own home to decide what's valid, what's not? Um, I remember growing up hearing stories of the way folks who lived in the area in Brooklyn, New York, where I grew up, remember shortwave radio broadcasts from their former Jewish relatives in Poland telling them, you've got to let people in America know what's happening because they're coming door to door and taking us away. We know what happened in the dawn of television and the civil rights demonstrations here in the 1960s and the power of that. We also know what happens in people's local civic associations and in their churches for how they learn about things. Um, in this era of tons of information on your little laptop, there are ways you can check out what, for example, is happening in El Salvador with people that we sent there to be detained, uh, not only in terms of a regular Google search, but also there's still a lot of the expert human rights analysts that used to generate this in the 70s and 80s, Amnesty International, Refugees International. A lot of churches have human rights reporting built into the system. The United States State Department has the annual review of human rights, although it's changing dramatically in how and what's reported under Trump. So there are these kinds of sources of information. But we today face an interesting challenge that hasn't been happening before. Welcome to AI and the world of AI.
All
In
right.
that world, for example, I woke up this morning and saw that social media was abuzz last night with photos of the new mayor of New York as a child in the company of Mr. Epstein because his mother was meeting Mr. Epstein and Ms. Maxwell. And given the explosion of attention to all of this, everybody whose name is on a list, everybody who's got prior photographs, all that's being blasted all over for good and for ill, except this was completely doctored, completely set up to
Hmm.
what? To disparagingly treat this new mayor, even with culpability for what he might have done as a 5-year-old child.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of explosion we have. The most dangerous thing about human rights in situations over the past couple of years has been that for all the cell phones and reporting and instant communication that people on the ground, let's say especially most recently in Syria or Ukraine, might have, governments have also commanded the technologies that allows them to know how many cell phones in what parts of their city are operative communicating with people overseas. And they either have the built-in jamming devices of those or simply are able to garner the addresses. We know from Minneapolis that photos are being taken of people who are protesters and it's being processed back through eye recognition and other kinds of things. Two people have mentioned, for example, they got notices from the State Department about their global entry cards are canceled because of their probability of disrupting federal officers doing their work. I don't know how many
Mm.
of you have
Well,
global entry, but it's important for travel and not staying in lines for 5 or 6 hours. And it's right of every American to have that. But now that they can rescind immediately on the basis of your photo as a protester, the global entry thing is really a concern. So we have much more obligation as individual citizens to ask the question, is this accurate that I'm reading or seeing? And how can I test that out? Where are the alternative sources of information? What's the range of
Yeah.
how to do this? And, some of you may remember an old politician came from New York, Senator Daniel Moynihan, who would say in political debates, you can argue about the policies, you can argue about what facts mean and their implication, but you can't argue about the facts. We live in a world in which the facts are immediately contentious as soon as they appear on a screen. And that's very discomforting to a lot of people,
Yeah,
understandably.
sure. So this new technology has pluses and minuses attached to it,
Yeah,
I guess, like everything else.
yeah.
So just to become a little more global here, the U.S. has founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution. And these documents suggest that the U.S. cares about human rights. Why then has sort of the government historically been reluctant to kind of sign on to so many of the international bodies that support human rights?
Well, that history is choppy, I think, in my estimation, right? The first is we were out of the gate after World War II, very importantly, with the first session of the United Nations in 48 of making sure that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a cornerstone of understanding what the new global order was going to be. As many of you know, Eleanor Roosevelt was a big champion of that. And that increased over time through a couple of different administrations into the mid 1960s when the International Covenant on Civil and Human Rights was passed, and then the International Convention on Economic, Political, and Social Rights. Um, our good author Jose Alvarez in this chapter in the Great Decisions book really makes a lot of those documents as foundational for the United States. What's really interesting is those documents in the 60s, which meant so much to the new African countries, having thrown off colonial rule and being new nations and joining the United Nations in the 60s. They wanted all these Western values. They wanted this as an indication of belonging to the global club of responsible values. What was happening on American streets in 1966 and 67 and 68 in terms of a continued fight for the level of civil rights in our own culture and our own country, even while we said yes globally at that time to all of those things. So there's always been, for some people, they would call it a hypocrisy of United States behavior. For others, they'll see it as calculated understanding of the importance of our sovereignty and the way the United States is uniquely positioned because of its great power and responsibilities to not always be dictated even by treaties that we ourselves signed, that we always have to operate in terms of our own self-interest. And for example, with regard to an international criminal court, even though we were champions of Nuremberg, we're not going to let this new international criminal court judge the behavior of an American soldier on a battlefield. That's the propriety only of the United States of America, even though that creation of a body to look at war crimes was something we originally supported a great deal, only to back away to not be a signature at the very end. So
Mm.
we've always had this ambiguity, some would say hypocrisy. We are in one of those swings now, not of underscoring the importance of rights for all. We're in one of those sovereignty-based times where people believe, why should the strong be constrained? Especially because we'll always do good.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So, just kind of to play off a couple of things you said there, the article in the briefing book kind of brought up three criticisms of kind of broader attempts, international attempts at fostering human rights. One was that they're ineffective. They've been in place for a long time and really nothing has happened. Second is that rights are not universal and that Western thinking really shouldn't be imposed on the rest of the world. And third, that the United States, as you just kind of mentioned there, has been the driver for many of these ideas, and U.S. sets the agenda regarding of which rights should be emphasized. What do you think of these criticisms? Do you think any of them are valid or not? Or
Yeah, I think there's more than a grain of truth to each of them. I think at their worst, they've been really overstated and, uh, guilty as charged by academics rather than necessarily folks on the ground and in the field. I'm not surprised that the 23 African states that were admitted to the UN from sub-Saharan Africa in the 1960s, by the 1990s, were still feeling a kind of colonialism about the political package they were operating with and the emphasis on civil and political rights. Are you running democracy with free elections? Are you doing this kind of thing for treatment of the press? Are you doing this with a constitution when they felt that 40% of their country was starving as global agriculture changes and all the rules of doing trade and aid were in favor of the rich countries, not them, that they might have a rebellion in the direction of we need more economic rights. We need more social and cultural rights, not just civil rights. So that grain of sand or grain of truth, excuse me, that they're not working, yeah, they're highly contentious and rights will be highly contentious. With regard to international law, I think there's a fundamental principle that is in every introduction to international law class, whether it's public international law taught by somebody like me or in the law school when you deal with international law. This body of material exists in real and past time, and it exists independent of your ability at a single time to enforce it. And I think that's important. This thing is
yes.
toothless international law. I don't see people being arrested. I don't see people serving jail time. This thing, forget it. That's not law. It's just stuff on a paper. Well, excuse me. We brought genociders and people guilty of mass atrocities to regional courts in the Inter-American Human Rights courts that Jose himself has served on, our author. We brought them before the International Criminal Court, and they've been sentenced to life in prison. These things work. Um, it's also the case that some of us may have had the experience when we went to a local court because our neighbor next door keeps doing something that we consider a violation of our property rights, and we go to a local court, and for some reason it gets thrown out on a technicality. So, does that law still exist? Yes, it just didn't come out in our day in court in our favor. So I think it's important to see that international law is as living as the entities, usually nations, but increasingly individuals and entities are willing to make it and willing to press to enforce it. Or even when it can't be enforced, then to critique that folks are to their own advantage trying to erode the law that is more better for the common good than otherwise. I do believe that there's more to be said for the critique, not that it's ineffective, but that there are collisions among cultures often about ownership of property, about what laws in our culture should stand for certain offenses, particularly things that are deeply based in our religious beliefs, um, that don't have to be shared with other countries. We just don't want those other countries imposing them on us. And there's a long history of pushbacks and evolution to that. I think especially in treating religious freedom or in treating women or the disabled, that's been the case even in our own culture over time. There was a time where women didn't have the right to vote here, but they did have a right to vote in other cultures. There was a time when we still had slavery here, but slavery had been abandoned and condemned in countries like UK and elsewhere. And so the evolutionary life of international law is important, and human rights has been a function of that. We happen to find ourselves in a period of low regard for this. The greatest enemy of human rights is war. We've got some of the most devastating global wars going on in multiple regions of the world, invitations to mass atrocities, lack of accountability for how women and children are treated in refugee camps, incredible bombing of civilian areas like World War II by Putin right now going on in Ukraine. So, yeah, is this a panorama of successful international law? No. But that doesn't mean we might soon have a chance to reinforce it, maybe enforce it against individuals perpetrating the crimes, but more importantly, to continue to underscore the norms and values under which this operates. Should cultures be debating whether or not there's a universal standard for treatment of certain individuals? Yes, because a lot of the cultures believe that there's a certain bar below which people shouldn't be treated. They shouldn't be stoned to death for a certain kind of religious act. Any number of things like this. This is, of course, the Western debate with Afghanistan and the treatment of women. This is why we saw the first set of bloody protests crushed by the state in Iran a couple of years ago for whether or not people should be forced, women should be forced to wear the hijab or not. This is evolutionary. And there are moments where we can say, boy, international law is failing us at every level here, but the law isn't failing us as much as our creative ability to find ways to restore it and to what? Hold the memories, hold the records, and make sure that we're clear about when violations have occurred. We can document them and do accountability later, sometimes much later.
Oh, I just want to maybe push back a little bit on this issue of, women, especially women, women make up half the people in the world. In a sense, the treatment of women has appeared not to have progressed much in some of these developing countries around the world. Why is that? In fact, it seems like some of it's gone backwards. And
And some of us feel we're living in a country now where we can't believe how women's rights has regressed. Yeah, I think that in other countries, it's so closely tied to economics. It's so closely tied to the culture of the family unit, and particularly on the cultural side, those things are more slow to evolve than others. What's happened in the development of many of those societies that became countries in the 1960s is that the successful economic growth often led to a cluster of wealthy elites who embraced, because they had the economic benefits of more global Western values. They could send their daughter to private school in their own country. They could send their daughter to Princeton for university training in the United States, whereas 70% of the people in the country had trouble accessing primary education
mm,
and still lived in an economic situation where every one of the children had to contribute to the economic well-being of the family, whether that's in the worst cases out begging in the streets, or it's carrying water back and forth for the town or the village, and they didn't have time for sending a girl to the religious school that just opened there down the road because they try and maybe she could learn a little bit, but boy, come harvest season, she's got to be home and the boy's got to be home. And so that collision of those things is what partly retards development of clusters of people. And then it's not challenged by the elites to overturn it and bring a more common good for all. In those worst cases, like in Iran, the religious kleptocracy decides it can be the cudgel to keep the population in check.
all right. It's a ancient problem. I guess it's not going to go away quickly. So, uh, just as a reminder, if you do have a question, please post it to the chat, and we'll get to it shortly here. Kind of change gears a little bit. Recent statements by several U.S. officials have suggested that international law is not a real thing. The reality is the law of the jungle is what shapes the world, and the U.S. is not going to be bound by what it may regard as arbitrary rules that inhibit its ability to maximize U.S. benefits or interest. Can we start a little bit of history here? Where did international law come from? Has it really been effective in kind of bringing about greater peace and prosperity in the world?
Well, most people would say there are aspects of the trading city-states of Greece and later even in the Roman Empire that manifested treaty behavior, manifested rules, particularly for the operation of commerce. That is, as you had growing entities of politics and commerce located in large clusters of people, either you're going to be at war with those folks or you're going to be cooperating. And the law of cooperation made the whole system function for a good while. Fast forward to the 16th and 17th century, and particularly in Dutch legal evolution in the UK, and parts of Germany, there emerged a consideration reinforced by the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. There were these things called nations, and these nations need to cooperate in order to have economic flourishing and make sure their culture could be protected. And you're either going to fight about it or you're going to agree about it. But since so many of the things developing as entities called nations seem to have similar rulers, population, economic needs, trade, they decided to change from the law of nothing to the international law as their system grew. And they established certain rules for who could deal with who in the name of the state, who could have diplomatic relations, who could sign trade agreements, who could command an army to protect the border. In its earliest stages, who could marry their third cousin to your third cousin so we'd have an alliance by marriage and protect ourselves politically and militarily. That was the evolutionary phase, which went through a boom in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly concerned about the behavior of the states to initiate war without having been offended or invaded themselves. So the laws of war, in terms of who can start it and under what conditions, developed. And that translated as the terrible massacres of war unfolded to look at what kinds of weapons could be used. And the cynical would say, so you can kill somebody one way, but you can't kill them another. How sick is that? Or you can say, no, something like mustard gas should be systematically prohibited in the way that nations engage in this behavior called war. If you can't stop the war from starting, you should at least regulate certain things about not only what weapons are used, but people's rights to surrender and be protected as a prisoner, and the right to hold people who violate those rules and commit atrocities, like machine gunning down prisoners who had surrendered. Those people should be held accountable after the war. So the development of international law was always in creative tension with what kinds of new offenses that we've developed in dealing with one another are we facing. But that's almost too much the headlines of it. I mean, for anyone who says now, international law is in shambles, have you been on an airplane in the last 3 or 4 years? Guess what protects us with some degree of sanity and survival as we get on an airplane? The workings of the International Civil Aviation Organization, a treaty-based entity of 191 nations and some principalities in the world, which guarantees not only how flight patterns are established, but the credentials and quality of training for grounds crews and pilots internationally. And these kinds of things don't fall apart. We have occasional accidents, but it's not because the law of civil aviation doesn't work. It's not because the law of international trade of goods and commodities doesn't work. We've got lots of stuff on our grocery shelves. So there's a lot of international law that we have become so accustomed to, including things like we could have an international audience to this call because the rules of email, etc., would permit this being transnational. That's guaranteed in law. There's a lot of things guaranteed in law, particularly in civil and political rights, and lack of protection from being bombed by the Russians if you have the right to live in Kyiv. But those two dynamics are different. The argument that we're hearing now, and again, excuse me for being partisan, but in this administration, is when you're the most powerful country in the world, you have no obligations to anybody else with regard to restraints on your behavior. Certainly not from 19th or 20th century laws that were passed when everybody was sort of about equal. We're the unequal among presumed equals. Whether friend or foe, all of them should fear us because right makes right and justice is in the hands of the stronger. Not that they all read The Republic by Plato, but that's what they claim. This is the norm. It will play out for a while. It will be increasingly self-destructive to us culturally, certainly politically, with those who spilled blood with us in Afghanistan and Iraq, and before that in other wars. When somebody says to you, we've never been so respected in the world, they haven't been to the meetings I've been in other parts of the world. Where one of the first, where the first thing a former good friend and colleague will say to me as they're driving with me from the airport, whether it's in Germany or UK, is, now you promised me you weren't going to ask for an asylum, right? But that's the state of some things.
Yeah.
Please, more questions.
Yes. Well, on a kind of a personal level, maybe you could talk a little bit about what the Kroc Center does at Notre Dame, and maybe more generally, what's the role of non-governmental non-governmental organizations in promoting human rights around the world?
Well, let me deal with the latter first. It's very kind of you to ask about the Kroc Institute. Um, Non-governmental organizations are voluntary groups of civil society, people like ourselves, who get together around support and interest in a common issue. And one of the strongest of these since World War II has been the international human rights movement, both in terms of the way transnational groups like Amnesty International had decided, based out of Western countries like in Europe and the United States and Canada, that when a government elsewhere is treating political prisoners harshly, we should care about that. In the same way we should care about incarceration rules in our own society, we should have the ability, said Amnesty International, to know about a prisoner, to know the prisoners who were there under false charges and may actually being treated and tortured in terrible ways in violation of international civil rights. We should know about them in other countries, and we should start a letter campaign and write to the government so the government gets 4,000 letters a day saying, let that person go. We're watching. The ability of organizations to do that, the ability of Human Rights Watch in various corners of the world to continue to remind people of the rights that their government states on paper, but is violating in practice, and how to seek redress of that is very important. In our own culture, we have the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, we have the American Civil Liberties Union and similar groups. Increasingly, transnational churches have become huge proponents and claimers of human rights concerns, not only for people in their own denomination, but for the general good of society. So I think non-governmental groups, which can and should include universities and colleges, concerned about citizen welfare and believing that when some are treated unjustly in one locale, that really is an attack on the values of all of us. And we should be in solidarity and action and thinking about this. They keep it going when governments won't or can't. And there's enough history of movements of this type concerned about rights toppling their governments, often nonviolently. Think about Lex Valenza. in Poland in the 1980s, organizing the ship workers and the dock workers. And I had a delightful former student who's still with us and alive, etc., but back in Poland, whose father was involved in the first layer of solidarity. And when we taught at the Kroc Institute various ways of nonviolent social change, etc., he told me the story that in one of the big first worker gatherings, laborers, hardened people knowing the history of the dock workers and the challenges they had with governments, um, with this newly imposed martial law of the early 1980s. Valenza got up there and he said, okay, here's our strategy of a general strike. Here's what we're going to do. And it's going to require this, this, and this. And somebody would jump up on their platform with holding an axe in their hand. Yes, because every Pole must spill their blood for freedom. And Valenza would say, no, the idea is that every Pole ought to organize and do this nonviolently. And he'd say some more things, and somebody else would say, like my grandfather, I want to die, spilling my blood for the freedom of Poles. And Valenza would say, no, we're going to sit down, we're going to do it this way. And that kind of movement for human rights, for peaceful transition of power, for what we're seeing on the streets of Minneapolis, or what we've seen in so many protests all across the United States to the violation of rights, that's what carries it. The role of colleges and universities is to teach some of the basics, like where did international law come from, and debate its effectiveness, and maybe train a couple of future lawyers to see that that would be so much better than a state law and maybe a bigger contribution as they think about their own legal career, with all due respect to those of you on our broadcast who practice the state law. Um, I think that our concerns that Father Ted was deeply committed to and Joan Kroc was deeply committed to is we cannot be a free and open and thriving set of cultures if the threat of nuclear war hangs over our head. And so they were deeply committed to the ending of nuclear war and bringing down of the arms race. That was a big theme for us and continues to be a theme. That's our least successful area. But what changed in the 90s as the wars in Yugoslavia and various wars in Africa began to rage is with Mrs. Kroc's agreement, we decided to focus not just on nuclear things, but on how we could bring a new set of potential peace builders to Notre Dame for a couple of years to learn these skills, earn the degrees, and then go back home and be involved in the search for peace and justice, which is always related to civil and human rights. We also have the huge, wonderful partner institution, the Klaus Center for Civil and Human Rights, which focuses deeply on rights while we focus on peace and justice. And I've learned so much from the 400 plus grads we have that came for a master's degree in peace building and then went home and are doing things at the top of their profession, including one who's a judge on the International Criminal Court, including others who are high in the foreign ministries of their own country. Unfortunately, we lost 7 graduates who were fired from their jobs in January in the State Department, who were doing great things in the U.S. State Department, and 4 who were in AID. So they call the old prof and say, hey, I know I'm 49, but what do I do now? And this is what we try to do, is to understand that mobilizing young and talented people can be a great commitment to peace and human rights. And it's a privilege to be able to associate it with that.
All right. Well, thank you very much, George. I have a couple more questions here, but I see we have a question from Claire Collins. Claire, you want to ask your question?
Yes, this has been very interesting. You mentioned that mustard gas was outlawed, was quite popular during World War I, and it was outlawed by the Geneva Convention. And I just wondered, how did napalm uh, being used in the Vietnam War, how did that get out there? Was it outlawed?
Um, it was outlawed by a number of states, but not at the level of a Geneva Convention, as I understand it. I do know that there could be responsibility in the development of environmental law for the use of napalm to clear out farmland. And in certain courts in Europe, you could be held accountable for the destruction of what was the potential right to food that people in a particular culture had. Napalm is not used very much anymore. We're much more concerned about phosphorus and various other um, white bullet things that are used in conflicts like in Syria. Um, but I'd almost venture to say, Claire, that sometimes there's norms of behavior that haven't been codified into treaty, but they're strong enough to be able to hold most places most of the time. And that for napalm was the start. And then, unfortunately, new and improved terrible ways of using chemical weapons have replaced it. So we're always in catch up, trying to make the next wave of deadly weapons less and less tolerable, less and yet less free of accountability. I don't know if that helps with your question.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think Betty's got a question.
First, I want to say, Ray, you might want to go to the chat because it looks like chat's disabled. And I don't know if other people are seeing that. We had this problem before. And I think
Okay.
what I did to get my question, or at least that I have a question to you, is to click on your name. So if you see the chat's disabled, click on Ray's name. I don't know, that's a glitch that's come up for us, and we need to see what we can do. We only experience it though when we're in a program. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, George, this is going to probably sound like a very simple question. We applaud those who come from other countries who and tell the stories of what they had to endure um, in the quest to live a better life, a freer life. The USAID used to have a newspaper, a journal called with the headline Twilight Struggle for Freedom. And one of the contracts I had with USAID was to write a series of articles about some aid projects. And I always was struck by that, the twilight struggle for freedom. And so we applaud people who struggle. And yet we hold people as a criminal for the very fact of just coming into this country illegally because they were in that twilight struggle for freedom themselves. And if we use that as the premises, that's the crime. Maybe they didn't kill or rape her, but that's the crime right there. How will these people ever? I frankly hold the view of 330 million people. We can absorb 11 million people. And if you want to look at it economically, they contribute a lot to our social security and our GDP and our economic. We can have real economic crisis if we actually sent them all home. But are they not also in that twilight struggle for feet? How do we get over and how do we legitimize just that step that we do for so many other refugees? Am I making sense with that?
Yeah, you are. And, there couldn't be a more timely question in certain ways. I don't expect us to be able at this moment to either change the mind of
No,
or to legislate or
not
to
with this
have
administration. No.
judicial decisions to
Yes.
change what's going on here. I'm almost less worried about how the folks who, for racial and other reasons, want to eliminate so many folks from our border
Mhm.
and have no understanding of asylum seeking, etc.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
what I'm more worried about is so many people in our community feeling so disenchanted by it and feeling paralyzed that there's nothing they can do. There's perpetrators, and then there's those who say nothing. And it's not because people agree with them, but it's because they either don't see a path of challenging this, or rightfully they're fearful, or they've, as I sometimes hear in our own community here in Chesterton, I've never done something like this before to get out there and do something. But the numbers we're seeing in American streets, the number of smart things that are being written by people who say, now it's time that enough is enough. And most of it is not about some radical leftist view. It's about, excuse me, when people come knocking at your door, they have to have a warrant signed by a judge. When people kick down your door and don't announce who they are and they're masked, we've gone far beyond a clerical era. We've gone to the point of secret police. Now, who's going to call that in your own community a secret police operation? Who's going to remember that we were 18 months away from a sweeping legislative bill that would have been the best thing since Ronald Reagan reformed immigration, that wouldn't have put us in this mess? And who's going to wake up Republicans and Democrats alike that you can't fix this unless you return to a base of something like that, and then understand what we need in the economy, and maybe in many cases, who your own grandparents were and who were they in that twilight. Thank
That's
you.
interesting. You mentioned the grandparent thing. I would I would be probably not a person able to get a citizenship based on my grandparent and parent immigrant status. So interesting.
Then fight the citizenship requirement that Steve Miller would like to bring to Congress
Yeah,
about birthright citizenship.
right. So um, again, hopefully, if you do have a question, if you doesn't seem to go through, just send it directly to me. George, I do have a question. We talked about Donald Trump a couple of times here. One of the things that is new is this Board of Peace. So, what is your thought about? Is this in fact something that actually could have an impact, maybe on a small scale basis, like a particular target area like Gaza? Could a group like this actually, you think, make a difference?
I was pleased to see him think about a particular set of well-connected individuals who would be singularly focused on Gaza. Um, that's a long tradition in international affairs, particularly based out of the UN, called the Group of Eminent Persons. There is no group of eminent persons, but for a particular problem, the Secretary General can create a group of eminent persons to deal with something that's not the priority of the Security Council and is too difficult or cumbersome or awkward for member states by themselves to get together and say, let's deal with that problem. I saw this as an analog to the group of eminent persons, some of whom will always be Nobel Prize winners, others will be seasoned diplomats, others will be folks with significant cultural and other backgrounds in the problem that they're being asked to address. So, for the creation of that for Gaza, as it evolved, what did I see? I saw continued plans by Jared Kushner and others for a Riviera type creation on the beaches of Gaza. I saw no stellar group of individuals who went to Egypt and argued with the government, you have to open up the borders and bring in 10 tons of humanitarian supplies a day in order to make this peace thing work. And now there's two layers of the proposed Board of Peace. The folks who pay $1 billion to join, and some others who somehow are lucky enough to get named. And some credible countries in the peace business, like Canada, have been uninvited for interpersonal and policy reasons. So I'm anywhere that peace is possible, I want to support those structures. This is not one yet that has proved itself to be effective. And I think you may have heard Betty say that for a couple of years I was a vice president at the U.S. Institute of Peace after my first retirement from Notre Dame. And that building that's across the street from the State Department, the U.S. Institute of Peace, was built as on private land by private donations in a huge fundraising effort that was co-chaired by Father Ted Hesburgh and George Shultz, former Reagan Secretary of State. They raised all the money for it. It was constructed. We had 300 people working in there, and Donald Trump took it over as the private property of the US government, which is why we're still fighting it in court, because it's essentially an embezzlement. And he's put his name on it, and that's where he wants to put that Board of Peace.
Hmm.
That's very
So,
unfortunate. Very
yeah,
unfortunate.
so it could have been a good thing.
It may still could yet be a good thing
Mhm.
if you understand peacemaking is not bringing leaders of two countries together for a big signing ceremony while four different militia groups in the country, meaning the Congo, are still fighting and stealing the diamonds in the country in a perverse illicit trade of wealth that robs the real citizens of that country of its natural resources.
All right. Janet had a question. You're muted, Janet.
Yes, one of the things that seems to be unclear is the difference. The term warrant is used. However, could you please explain the difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant?
If I was a certified lawyer, I probably could with some accuracy. My understanding is only what I read in the media,
Mhm.
and that is a judicial warrant is a usually law enforcement agency goes to a judge and says, we have probable cause that this person under these conditions has done that. In the case that is most celebrated lately, illegal immigration, this person at that address has not, cannot manifest the proper papers of having been here, and maybe even is under suspicion of certain kinds of criminal activity, like maybe being member of a gang. And the judge is willing to say that's sufficient to go and arrest someone. Here's the warrant. When those warrants have been issued, our understanding more often than not is the warrant is used to get the people, and there is no connection for them to a lawyer. There's no full analysis of their situation. For example, the number of people who have been arrested outside a courtroom when they're making their monthly visit with a local judge on their way to the completion of their asylum case, they're being taken away and deported or sent to detention centers and then deported. Some of them have been able to be stopped in detention centers because some of the same judges that issue the judicial order say, wait a minute, no, you can't deport that person without due process. But here sit all these people in Texas. An administrative warrant is because of our agency, like the US Border Patrol, having responsibility for these tasks, our our agency authorizes these personnel to detain you for questioning. That's my understanding of the difference, but I'm sure a good lawyer in our audience can tell us more precision to be accurate.
Thank you.
All right. Charlie or Carrie Boswell, you guys have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious, do you think we can ever regain the trust of other countries without charging, trying, and convicting any of the Trump administrations who are currently committing crimes? I just don't see how we can ever regain the trust of other nations as long as we tolerate some of the kinds of blatantly illegal actions of this administration.
Yeah, no, it's a very important question, and I think it will vary from country to country. I'll base my kind of a tentative response, Gary, on what we've seen from other countries' reactions to January 6th. And most of those were, how did you not see that as an attempt to steal an election and overthrow your government. How did you not see that?
Right.
And they were waiting to see when all of this came about, and there seemed to be a special investigator. There seemed to be all of this stuff and the slow grinding wheels of the way that the United States does its justice system. And then Trump smartly or just by dumb luck was able to beat that system. And because he was elected, then added insult to the injury from the point of view of our foreign colleagues and friends by then pardoning all the people that were associated with it. One good friend I have in France said to me about a week after, you know, that's his militia who's going to do that the next time.
Amen.
And
Absolutely.
then he said, you all can't be this stupid. So trust is one thing,
Yes, we can.
smarts is another, determination is another. It puts an incredible burden on Democratic or independent candidates for office in the 2028 election.
2026 election.
Well, 2026 is, yeah, enough of a national election, but I'm thinking about the folks
Oh,
who
yeah.
might win the White House.
Yeah.
You know, should you be asked in one of the debates, as a Democrat who wins, will you seek retribution or something else on an outgoing administration?
Hmm.
Now, you may not be seeking retribution, but you do believe that reasonable application of the law after these people leave, and in terms of what they did, particularly out of the Department of Justice or the Department of Treasury, maybe should be grounds for indictment.
Mhm.
But are you then participating in what might be seen as a rolling 4 years of every new administration comes in and prosecutes the last one, et cetera, et cetera? Or might you do something like, for the good of the country, just like Richard Nixon was pardoned, I pardon these people, but part of the pardon is conditioned on they no longer speak in public about political life.
That was a mistake that Ford made. Oops,
Yeah.
I'm talking.
It's such an appropriate question. And in terms of trust, the earning time is now probably doubled and tripled as this goes on.
Kind of a follow-up to that, who are, I don't like using the word enemies, but our competitors in the world for geopolitical influence. How do they view what's going on in the United States? And are they gleeful about this? Are they like, uh, what kind of reaction, like Russia's and China and maybe even some neutral countries like India, how are they viewing these goings on in the United States?
The they, of course, is the bulk of the population. And in neither China nor Russia do we have a way of assessing what the bulk of the population thinks about their own leadership or our leadership. Um, I think you could see those who are strongmen, like Prime Minister Modi in India, feel a certain kind of affinity for Trump, but they also understand how temporal this is. So they're going to play as much as they can both ends against the middle. And if I can get my tariffs reduced by another 12%, I'm going to do it. And we'll see where it goes. The kind of deep concern about values, deep concern about can you count on the United States? Um, that's already been decided by all our European allies who have sympathy for citizens like us, but at the same time say, why are you all sitting on your hands?
Hmm. So the European Union, of course, is most closely aligned with us, from a cultural and financial perspective. Are they nervous about the future of our relationship? I mean, I hear a lot of different reports. I mean, from your perspective, You
I
talk
think
to
they're
these
past the
people.
nervousness stage, Ray. I think they're very past the nervousness stage. They're worried more about, are they dealing with a rational actor country who can't separate out core strategic interests from wistful opportunities that they might want to seize. And their biggest concern, given the fact that they've had to pledge and are delivering on much more massive expenditures for defense, that the European battle plan against Putin has already emerged with no dependence on the United States.
Hmm. So the briefing book had as a kind of a final summary 3 suggestions about how things might play out in the future. So maybe we could kind of get your perspective on this. The first was that um, kind of a retrenchment of nationalism, and that human rights will become kind of very, very constrained within a particular national border, and there won't be a lot of cross-border concern about human rights. Second suggestion that the author made was that things are going to, this is a blip in the road. Things are going to kind of continue on as the way they have, that human rights will steadily progress and get better in the future, but on a gradual basis. The third suggestion the author made was that somehow there's going to be a new way of thinking, a new paradigm about what human rights means in the world. I'm not sure what he meant by that exactly, but what is your take on where we're going with respect to human rights?
I guess since I believe that international law and human rights have always been evolutionary with some combination of challenges to them that undermine them, but then also later resurgence of them in reaction to that, etc., that we may, in a very cumbersome, awkward way, limp our way into a bit of a better time and then get much more serious about it, provided we can avoid major violent conflict among superpowers, and provided we can dramatically reduce the number of regional and local wars that are going on. I think that's key, is we have to reduce the willingness of any small number of groups or nations to use military force to attain their goals rather than we debating cooperative and other means by which you settle your disputes. Um, I guess, especially looking at our audience, most of us have heard of and probably owned at a period in time in our life a slinky. You know how the slinky goes around and around and around and around. Some of that means sometimes it's going forward, but when it comes out the bottom end, it's going a little bit backward and forward and backward. But over all those things, you get to the end of it finally. And if you're really skilled, you can put it on your top stair and make it come down and go all the way down. That's the way I think I see the evolution of this.
All right. So in terms of the last point that the author made, though, maybe you could help me a little bit. I'm trying to understand when he was talking about a new radical way of thinking about human rights. Is there something to that made sense to you, or?
Sure. Um, a way that decides the fundamental competition we had for generations between civil and political rights and liberties in that area on the one hand, and the kind of leftovers of socialism that you've got to be concerned about socioeconomic rights generally of the society and um, increasingly cultural rights. There can be a strong decision to combine those in certain kinds of ways that underscore that some of the most basic human needs, like the rights to food, the rights to clean air, the rights to clean water, are the key platforms for structuring in a society and upon which the cultural rights, the civil rights, and others can flourish better. That those two don't be in competition, but can be built on a larger common good model that enshrines the notion that no society and therefore no child should go hungry. I saw somebody put in the chat the concern about disabilities. Yes, it's great that the UN will go ahead and say we need a new culture of attention to disabilities, partly because look at all the victims of war we have, where that disability is not only loss of limb and other kinds of things, but the generations of children that are traumatized by war and the effect of that on developing brains of children in refugee camps or any number of other related things. Europe is growing a number of master's programs in disability studies, particularly for this reason, to be able to meet right at the forefront of people who are coping with trauma, talking about the need of a society to restructure itself. We thought we were doing this well when we just put up ramps somewhere so people didn't have to, in their wheelchairs, somehow have friends help them negotiate up getting on stairs. But there's a whole different way of thinking about how you treat the human experience that's been dominated by violence, that's got to be key to moving a society and the common good forward. So disabilities as rights may be a revolutionary area, but you need maybe that vanguard or that fulcrum point to be able to reestablish the interrelationship of the others.
Right. Actually, we have a question from Julie Van. Julie?
He started to address that. Um, and when he mentioned the UN, because the UN has a set of objectives and goals for people with disabilities, and it was signed by an enormous number of countries, including Poland, and the US didn't bother to sign it because they didn't want to meet the standard that was being set forth for the international society. And so I was just curious. You spoke about war and things going on in Europe, but I was just curious with Trump in office now. I'm worried about those programs that we're pushing for opportunities for people with disabilities in the United States surviving what's going on right now.
Well, the most celebrated confrontation Trump had with someone with disabilities was in his campaign in his first term, where he found a way to systematically mock that person.
Yeah.
So I don't have high hopes for him helping the society as a whole set generally high standards for the responsibility of all of us who are, through the luck of genes or circumstance, do not now face disabilities. But as we are a population that can grow older, more healthy for a long while, more of us may wind up disabled at the end of our lives. And so one would think a principle like caring for the common good or things like that would very much move in the direction of being hospitable to this. So I don't have a lot of expectations in this administration, but I do believe that there's a way in which joining the global effort on disabilities, joining the global effort on dealing with pollution, joining those things can be the low-hanging fruit of reestablishing enough structural relationships where we're an honest co-participant, that we repair piece by piece some of the lost trust, that we become a good citizen of a globe where we have no choice but to be one of the citizens.
Thank you.
All right. We got one more question here from Betty. And Betty, I think this could be our last question for the evening. So if you want to ask the question and then
Wrap it up.
wrap it
This
up.
may give us an opportunity, and I'm sure that many have thought about this. There's been comment about the framers didn't envision a type of a presidency we've got here in Trump when they were drafting it. But on the other hand, they didn't really trust anybody but white men who had property. They weren't, if people would sort of read more history, they would see that the founding fathers, some of them were dubious about democracy being practiced at lower levels. Um, but with my students, I'd be curious with Notre Dame. This man has used, all presidents in recent years have used that executive order to make law, and Trump has just imploded with it. And my students have a suggestion for an amendment, which is really a good one, and that is to limit the number of executive orders a president can use so that it forces Congress to function as legislative power. And they're not, and they see this as a possible solution for the future. I'm wondering if you've had an opportunity, even though you retired, if you've had an opportunity to talk with the students at Notre Dame, the future really is in their hands with this. We will come out of this. How we come out, I personally wonder if I recognize the country, but we will come out, and this hopefully will give us an opportunity to reassess where our new power should be in the area of healthcare and education and climate change. The students are curious where their placement is. They're worried about AI. They think an amendment also on the right to privacy is a good one because they're afraid of AI impeding their privacy. What do you hear from the students, the young students in Notre Dame, as they ponder their future and look at all this? This is all they've known. They've known Trump for 10 years. They think this is politics. And what do they see? How do they look at this in their future and changes?
I wish I could fully address that because I haven't taught undergrads since my first retirement, and then even in my failed retirement to going back, I've only been dealing with high-level graduate students and law
Mm.
students. So what the average 19-year-old says or thinks or worries about, I haven't had the marvelous opportunity of dealing with that in a class. But I do have friends and who teach American politics and others who find the reflection of the wider society in the classroom, some polarization that wasn't there
Mm.
a decade ago, partly because polarization has been legitimated on both sides of the polls. And but I haven't heard much else. I also know there's a lot of Notre Dame undergraduate organizations that are very much moved by concern for the common good and being so proactive with that, thinking that the best way to deal with the national problems that they can't touch, uh, is to try to solve the way they're unfolding locally. So the amount of volunteerism in the South Bend community with social problems, particularly those that are now underfunded, has been pretty outstanding, I think. That you can see from afar without being in the classroom from someone. But that's also being replicated throughout the state, you know. And so, yes, you're right. The young people are the future. Um, that's why some of them say, "Hey, Mitch McConnell, hey, Schumer,
Mhm.
time to move aside.
Mhm.
Time for younger people,
Mhm.
geez, in their 40s, who might get elected instead of the folks in the 70s and 80s."
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. They don't want two more old white men running for president. I hear that a lot.
Yep,
But
yep.
on the other hand, they did have an option in 2024.
Yeah, that's a subject for a different 90 minutes than this one.
Yes. She wasn't really young, but she was an option and she would have been unique and new. Are there any other questions from anybody else? We could really go on all night. We really should, George, have made this. Claire, how did you make that going to the tap? Remember when we decided to experiment with something? George, when we were still in person, it wasn't
Yeah,
uncommon for a bunch of us to go to a bar afterward and carry on the conversation.
yeah,
If we could drag the speaker with us, all the better. And you thought, well, let's do this. Tell people we're formally ending now. It's 8:30. But for those of you who want to carry on, go to your logger and grab whatever and bring it back and we'll carry on. What did we call that, Claire? Do you remember?
Um, I don't
It was
remember.
your name that came up with
Oh,
it.
the nightcap session.
Nightcap set. Well, yeah,
nice.
nightcap. I wish we had perhaps made this a nightcap session because it would have been really great. Because we would have wanted you to have joined us. We did it a couple of times when actually the speaker could, and one time the speaker couldn't. But by golly, there were people who
Yeah.
said, "I will." But we could really go on and on, couldn't we, with this subject? And
But you've got 7 other sessions coming your way, so
we'll have to think which one can be a nightcap. Yeah, that's a really good. This I do see this though. This has been something that's turned even the most hardcore Pollyanna into some level of deep cynicism. But we may have an opportunity to, when we come out of it, say, we may lose some of our world power and global presence. And maybe that won't be such a bad thing if we can turn it and say, well, by the way, what's the status of our education, our healthcare? Where are we on climate change? In addition to some roads and bridges. So we'll see. If no one has any other questions, again, I want to thank you so much for kicking off Great Decisions 2026. We do have 4 more sessions to come. And I should have before me, I got so absorbed in tonight's program. I do know what it flashed. 1 second. Let me look at my little calendar right here.
and while you do that, I'll thank you all and Ray for the good questions and thank you for your engagement with this tonight. Thank you.
Ray does a great job moderating because he keeps it folksy, and we like that. I would tell you folks that are with us that we Great Decisions is America's longest running sort of public forum of discussion, and I often tune into some other Great Decisions, and they're all wonderful, they're all nice, and everybody has their own style, and sometimes they're very formal, and they come in the suits and they're very, very formal, and we want ours to be a conversation. And we want that to be, we want to be able the people to engage with our speakers, but we want it to be a conversation, to have it be relaxed, as though we are, because we are in our living rooms, indeed, aren't we? And Ray does a really great job of keeping it like that. So thank you, Ray, for doing that. You can't go anywhere, Ray. You can't, even if you leave the board, we'll tackle you anyway. So, but don't, you can't. But next Thursday, we have Dr. Pierre Atlas. I know many of you know Dr. Atlas. He's also on the board. Ever so often we have someone from our own come on, and Pierre's got that background to do that. And he's going to be talking about Trump foreign policy. It's going to be a lot of our sessions this year. And he is our president, and there's been a lot of changes. He's impacting a lot of global discussion, and our foreign policy has it changed? We'll find out next week. Has it really changed? We'll have a big discussion on that. And we will take a look at those topics and see which one should be a nightcap. Too late for one tonight. But join us next Thursday, please. You know how to sign up. We'd love to have you join us. For those of you who are new, please come back. I want to also remind you, if you've not thought about becoming a member, it's very affordable. It's $50. I mean, annual membership, and it's very important. If when we have an opportunity at some point to again seek funding, right now is a bit of a difficult time to do that. Having people you can say is a part of your membership is really important to a funding agent to say, well, this is good that we support you. But the best thing for you is that you get a nice discount for coming to our programs. And also when you get the Daily Chatter. It used to be called the Daily Chatter, now it's the Global Post. And these are a very good summary of what's going on in the world that you can actually read in probably 2 or 3 minutes. And they're credible, it's informed, it's incredible, and it keeps you in touch with what's going on in the world. So when you're talking with other people about it, you are speaking from credible sources. So we cut through a lot of the nonsense and get right to the to what's really informed. And with that, we will say good night. Thank you again, Dr. Lopez.